This is Gotham Balaji back with APUSH Chapter 3, Settling the Northern Colonies. So in about 1517, Martin Luther, during the Protestant Reformation, nailed his ideas on the doors of the Wittenberg Cathedral in Germany, denouncing the authority of priests and popes and declaring that the Bible was the source of God's Word. Right? Obviously, this caused more religious discontent in Europe because it was challenging the standing ideas that all these new cardinals and popes were having their new interpretations, and that would be, held more strongly than that of the Bible. Then, after Martin Luther, John Calvin came forth, who's from Geneva, and put forth Calvinism, which was the belief that all humans were predestined for eternal bliss or eternal hell, through predestination for their eternal lives, regardless of what they did in their real life, which caused huge discontent all throughout Europe. So more by the Reformation. So the Calvinists believed in conversion, or the receipt of God's free gift of saving grace, which was an intense experience in which God revealed the heavenly destiny to the individual. Now, when this idea went to England, as Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church, Henry stimulated English religious reformers to take purification of Christianity, and he wasn't comfortable totally with the idea of predestination. So the Puritans were then asked to develop Calvinism and then to feed on social unrest and spiritual comfort for the economically disadvantaged English, as the English slowly made the change away from the Catholic Church into ideas like predestination and eventually the Church of England, which was a Protestant church. So the Puritans, they were the most devout people who believed that only the visible saints, people who felt the stirring of grace in their souls and demonstrated the presence to fellow Puritans, could be admitted to their exclusive membership. Now, there were extremists who didn't even want to fraternize with the Church of England, and the normal Protestants, and they became known as the separatists. Now, King James I, he knew the importance of becoming a spiritual leader to the people, as in centuries before, the king was also not only a spiritual leader, but also a leader to the government. And he thought that if all of these religious revivers and reformers were taking a different path and worshiping a different faith, then he was going to lose power. So he in turn harassed the separatists to leave the land so he could keep his influence over, the British Empire. So the Pilgrims, which were a group of separatists in Holland, and they negotiated with the Virginia Company, and then they settled their rights to sail to the New World. But they missed the destination of New England in 1620 by dozens of miles. They sailed on the Mayflower. They had Captain Miles Standish, who was the leader on the ship, and they landed on the area of Plymouth without a charter from the company. So they had no legal right to settle on the land, as they didn't land in the area which was given to them by the Virginia Company. And before they landed onto the New World, they signed the Mayflower Compact, which was the document that the Pilgrims used as the basis for their government, which was signed by 41 adult males and one mister. And this was a future way to set up government. That'd be the basis for the fundamental orders, the Constitution as well. Now, more about the Pilgrims. In the first winter of 1620 to 1621, it was horrific. Only 44 people survived. The next fall, however, was different. It was the first Thanksgiving Day in New England, and the colony had economic sectors, to some extent, in fur, fish, and lumber. And they proved that the English could survive in the climate and could handle any sort of hardship that the region threw them that way through the climate. Now, they also had strong leaders like William Bradford, who became their governor, and they had unified religious beliefs to some extent, which did help them. The colony never economically or politically impacted England to the extent that we know the Pilgrims do, but it did show the basis that even a disorganized group of settlers, with so much going wrong against it, with only 44 people surviving, could still survive and still be somewhat successful as a colony. Now, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So in 1629, the Puritans feared for their faith and for England's future, and they secured a royal charter to form the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They wanted a separate colony from the influence of the Catholic Church, from the Church of England, because these were the separatists, the really extreme people who felt that only their extreme beliefs of Christianity and predestination were the most righteous beliefs. This expedition was much better than that of the Puritans. They had skilled workers, more supplies, and thousands of immigrants ready to work. And this immigration occurred during the Great English Migration, where about 70,000 people left England to the West Indies, Americas, or other areas of Europe for economic opportunity, as it showed that England was not able to sustain itself because of their growing population and their abysmal economy. So people were leaving to help find other areas to support themselves. So this was success, as the educated people at the Bay Colony, which included future Governor John Winthrop, who became its governor, calling from God. They had such success because they were organized, they had supplies, and they each covered their jobs because they were united through the Puritan belief. They had a shared sense of purpose. They had believed they had a special covenant from God to own that land and to practice their beliefs in that land. And this very, contingent idea of unity helped them survive and helped them thrive in the area, opposed to the Pilgrims. They did have problems, however. Only the freedmen adults who belonged to the Puritan congregations were given abilities to vote, and in some towns, all male property owners could vote. But this was still a small percentage of the population, still bigger than that of England, but it was still a small percentage of the population. And some Puritans believed that only the visible saints should vote, and these people were the people chosen by God, and very small percentage of the Puritan population. They thought only they should be able to vote and join the exclusivity of the Puritan Church. Yet they still expected all the other people and all the non-visible saints and all the non-believers to pay duty to the church and obey their faith. So this double standard of the Puritans did cause some problems with their citizens. Not too many, but some problems. Now, on the concept of religious power, many leaders believed that the admission to church membership had control over the growth and the prosperity of the colony, as John Cotton, who was an example of a preacher who preached the government's right to enforce religious rules because they thought it was their covenant and their mandate from God to use their puritanical beliefs to help control the people of the colony. The power of preachers weren't absolute, but the congregations had a right to hire fire ministers. There were clergymen were barred from political office, opposed to these strong bishops in traditional Europe. And the Puritans were wary of religious and political leaders being the same person. It was a shot at James I, who wanted to be control of the religious denominations in England as well as the political leader in England. And the Puritans wanted to separate that. And this is the first example you see in the New World, the separation of church and state. Even though the Puritans weren't really a clear-cut example of that, as their beliefs still dominated the government, they still didn't want the leaders being the same. They still didn't want their religious leaders being the same political leaders. So more about the Puritans. They believed in the Protestant ethic, which involved serious commitment to all religious and economic pursuits. They made sure that all pleasures were simple by finding marriages without parental consent, and they set precedent for blue laws or repressive laws on social conventions, as you'll see, like no card games, no drinking, no smoking. All these ideas were made by the Puritans, who believed that there should be some sort of ethical codes implemented and enforced by the government. Overall, it was a successful economy, and be cognizant of that for the test. So trouble in the Commonwealth. So the Quakers had a presence in the colony, but they were prosecuted with fines, floggings, and banishments. And one challenger in the Massachusetts Commonwealth and the Bay Colony was Anne Hutchinson, who believed in antinomianism, which is a belief that the holy life was no sure sign of salvation, and the truly saved didn't need to bother the law of either God or man. So it was a very radical belief at that time. And she was brought to trial and banished to Rhode Island, but she was a threat to the order and the stability of the Bay Colony. So Roger Williams and Rhode Island. So he was a radical man who was an extreme separatist as well, but he did challenge the legality of the Bay Colony's charter, and in return he was condemned for taking land without fair compensation to Indians. And his beliefs and his outwards disrespect to the Massachusetts Bay Colony government caused him to be booted from the colony and sent to another area where he would later found as Rhode Island, a future state that was full of toleration and in certain aspects the total opposite of what the Bay Colony was. So Rhode Island, this was a state that had complete freedom of religion regardless of religion, this time including Jews and Catholics, which was opposed to the Toleration Act in Maryland, which had freedom for all sects of Christianity, but not Jews and atheists. They demanded no oaths regarding religious beliefs like the Puritans. They sheltered, they caused Quakers, and they endorsed all full religious tolerance throughout the colony. Now, they attracted all these rejects and these scattered settlers to the Rhode Island area, and the island became known as Rogues Island because you have all these unwanted people who were the rejects and the lower members of the class of different areas coming to Rhode Island as a way of refuge from persecution and a way to start their new life. And unfortunately, it became known as Lord's Debris, which really isn't a flattering name, but that was kind of the makeup of Rhode Island. So, Connecticut. This was after an energetic group of Boston Puritans led by Thomas Hooker swarmed in the Hartford area and created a settlement there. This was a kind of an offshoot of the Bay Colony, and the founders of the Connecticut colony created a document known as the Fundamental Orders, which became the modern Constitution and established a democratic regime for the citizens, which were later borrowed by the Connecticut for its colonial charter. And the Fundamental Orders, as I mentioned before in another video, was kind of the precedent for our Constitution, the first way of setting up a constitutional government. And New Haven was also another Connecticut settlement. It was founded by the Puritans to set up another church-government alliance like in the Bay Colony, but eventually the Puritans angered James I, and he eventually made it another royal colony and converged it with Hartford, and they became Connecticut, a pretty secular area compared to the Bay Colony. So Connecticut and New Hampshire, as I mentioned before, he became in disfavor with Charles II, and they merged New Haven with the more democratic settlements. And New Hampshire, which was another state, had a fishing and trading empire that started to build along the Bay Colony, and they tried to grow economically separate from the crown. But because the Puritans just kept on annoying Charles II, he made Massachusetts a royal colony, so back in control of the crown, but he granted New Hampshire a separate charter so that it would have some sort of respect as well. So Charles II is a king who has a bad relationship with the colonies, and in turn is trying to get back at the Puritans, as he made New Haven part of the democratic settlements in Connecticut, and here he's making Massachusetts a royal charter. So the settlers versus the Indians. So the Indians first tried to befriend the settlers with the Wampanoag trying to befriend the Pilgrims when they first came. They were led by Squanto, who signed a treaty with the Plymouth Pilgrims, which then they celebrated famously Thanksgiving the same year. But eventually conflict did start to rise at the Connecticut River Valley between the Pequot tribe and the English settlement and the English militiamen. And like any other fight between the settlers and the Indians, you will see that the Pequot War caused brutal annihilation of the tribe in an easy peace for decades, as the English had just had more supplies, more manpower, and just more determined to keep the land. And they slowly, the first push of moving the Indians westwards, even though just to the western regions of the Connecticut Valley area, it was still a westwards push. So more about settlers and Indians. So the Indians' hope for resisting the English was tribal unity, which was led by Metacom, a tribal chief in the area, who forged alliances and caused attacks in New England, hitting frontier settlements hard and causing a war. But when the war ended, the Puritan towns that had been attacked, destroyed, got up, recovered, and thousands of Indians lay dead, with Metacom being killed. He actually was quartered. Each of his extremities were cut off and drawn by horses, and his family was sold into slavery, so with total decimation of the tribe. And Metacom became known as King Philip, and this started a lot of the westwards march of the English into the areas of New England, as the Indians just kept on being pushed off or they were annihilated in whole. So the New England Confederation. So, sorry for some typos. But the four colonies banded together to form the New England Confederation during the English Civil War, which was to defend the colonies against the Dutch, the French, and the Indians. Each state held 2 votes regardless of size, which was kind of unfair to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which held by far the most people and by far the most wealth. This was a Puritan club which included the Bay Colony, Plymouth, Connecticut, New Haven, and the Valley settlements. So it excluded Rhode Island on purpose. And the King, Charles II, paid little attention to the colonies during the early years. But Charles II tried to put a bigger emphasis on the rural colonies, as they wanted to prop it up against the joint stock settlements. So this was the first American Revolution. I say that in quotes. However, the Dominion of New England was created by the royal authority and was aimed at bolstering colonial defense. It was controlled by Parliament as well, and it was efficiently to administer the English navigation laws. Now, the navigation laws were to limit the colonial trade with countries not ruled by the English crown, like Spain and France, with the colonies, and the Americans frequently just disobeyed them for smuggling and private businesses. And this idea of just ignoring the navigation laws is an idea you'll see all up to the actual American Revolution in 1776. And the head of the New England Dominion was Edmund Andros. He was the despised leader who was in charge of British troops in the colonies. And as you can see, Andros was ruthlessly curbed during town meetings. He put heavy restrictions on courts, the press, and schools, and he taxed people without any representation in Congress. The people of England engineered, however, in England, totally different sphere of influence. They engineered the Glorious Revolution by dethroning the Catholic James II and putting in William III, a Dutch-born Protestant leader. And the Glorious Revolution, so it's one of the most important parts of history during this time, with the Immortal Nine, Battle of Boyne, very influential part of Europe being affected right now. The Glorious Revolution caused the end of the Dominion of New England, and Andros was forced to flee back to New England, and the colonies slowly had somewhat of a relaxed grip put on them by the crown. So the effects of the Glorious Revolution: Massachusetts got stripped of its charter, was no longer bound by Puritan beliefs. The Glorious Revolution also caused the enforcement of salutary neglect, a policy where the navigation laws were weakly enforced as long as there was trade with England. And finally, the more English-educated noblemen were sent to America regardless of the functioning of the colonies, as they realized that regardless of how successful the colonies were economically, Europe was still the main point and the main center of education in the world at this time period. So the Dutch fought the Spanish with Protestant England during the 80 Years' War to win their independence. They did become a colonial power with the greatest activity in the East Indies, and they used the East India Company as a state within a state, as the East India Company had an army and a government. And the Dutch West India Company maintained profitable enterprises in the Caribbean, and it had outposts in both Africa and Brazil. It was a smaller version of the Dutch East India Company, but it was still a powerhouse company sort state that functioned for the Dutch government. And New Netherland was established in the Hudson River with the fur trade with Indians. And New Netherland was the kind of the flagship settlement for the Dutch in the Americas. So New Netherland was fully run by the Dutch East India Company for the interest of stockholders, and therefore had no reason for religious free speech or democracy. This was a company, plain and simple. They were all about the moolah. So the religious dissenters were savagely abused, they were banished, and the entire power of the settlement was controlled by the company itself. And as a result, there was a lot of bribery and a lot of graft, and vast feudal states called patroonships were granted to promoters who settled 50 people in the Hudson River Valley area. And as you can see, you have a lot of areas of fraud and squatters happening. So there was problems with business. So the company shareholders just wanted profits and dividends regardless of what was happening with the colony. And the Indians retaliated to the poor treatment of them, as since the Dutch East India Company infringed on the land and refused to negotiate, with massacres, and it caused the Dutch to build a wall in an area, and that area became later known as Wall Street. Get it? A wall. And the Dutch were hostile to both New England and the Swedish trespassing the area, as the investors were highly paranoid of losing their investments. And as you can see, all of these problems with the business eventually became political problems. The end of New Netherland was near. Charles II, the King of England at the time period, he granted land to the Duke of York, New York, near New Netherland, and the English sent their squadrons to the area to help conquer the territory. Peter Stuyvesant was the Dutch leader, the Dutch governor at the time, but because the colony was just so illy prepared, they didn't have a functioning army, and the East India Company didn't have any reinforcements at the time period. They just surrendered even without any gunshots, any warfare, and this was the removal of the Dutch from the mainland colonies. And after this, the English now controlled from Maine to the Carolinas, so they controlled a majority of the east coast of the Americas. And as a result, with the English control of New York, the English governors granted acreage to their favorite aristocratic friends, causing land-owning families like the Livingstons to grow powerful in New York, and a lot of corruption, as you will see without the history of New York, from the Albany Regency to Tammany Hall. This was the first era of corruption in New York City. The Dutch did leave their names of the land and their social customs, but their political impact in New York was minimal. So the Quakers were a religious group who were in England. This is a totally new sphere now. Who they refused to support the Church of England with taxes, and they believed that all people were children of God, and they didn't really believe in predestination. They didn't take any oaths. They had passive resistance, and they were principled people who did their convictions, not people who wanted to make a quick buck. William Penn eventually became a follower after he realized how sincere these people were, and in 1681 the king gave the aristocratic Penn the ability to make a colony, which he then used to charter because the king owed Penn's father a debt. So Penn's colony became Pennsylvania. This is the best advertised of the colonies. Penn sent out agents to help promote settlement of the states. Penn welcomed citizens and workers of all different skills, backgrounds, nationalities, just to have this colony full of tolerance and full of acceptance and full of diversity. It was populated by all these different groups: the Dutch, the Swedish, the English, and the Welsh. And Penn made sure that there was a fair treatment of the native people, and they did have some sort of tolerance with the Indians in the area as well. So how good of a guy was William Penn? He had a no tax supported church, and he didn't demand any allegiance to be a Quaker. He had free religious tolerance. There was no death penalty. There was little slavery. There was no standing military in the army in the colony. Excuse me. They did have some blue laws to limit card games and drinking, but overall there was a lot of freedom in the area. And the colony was the third largest in terms of wealth and population in the 1700s, after the Massachusetts and the Virginia colony, which is even more shocking because they were mostly made of poor immigrants, and they didn't have large funders like the Virginia Company and the Massachusetts Bay Company. So New Jersey, where we're from, the Quaker settlements, they flourished in New Jersey in 1664 when the proprietors received the area from the Duke of York. And many New Englanders came from the horrible soil up north to set up a sanctuary in Pennsylvania, and eventually a group of Quakers acquired East Jersey in 1702, and eventually both parts were put together in the same year, and New Jersey became a royal colony. So Delaware is named after the harsh Lord De La Ware, the harsh military leader of Virginia who defeated the Powhatans and also the Irish when they were encouraged by the Spanish to rise up and have tumultuous rebellion. Delaware was presented to some Quakers, was also very much associated with the Quaker Pennsylvania, and it was actually ruled by the governor of Pennsylvania until the American Revolution. So the middle colonies were made of New Jersey, New York, Delaware, and Pennsylvania's. The soil was fertile, the land was broad, became known as the bread colonies because they exported a lot of grain. And obviously rivers have played a huge role with the success of the middle colonies, like Susquehanna, the Delaware, and the Hudson. And lumbering and shipbuilding weren't only limited to the New England colonies, as there were successful industries in North New York and Philadelphia because there were also seaports. So between the South and New England, let's compare some stuff. So the landholdings were generally intermediate in size between the large plantation in the South and the small farm in New England. The local government was a median between the personalized town meeting of New England and the county government of the South and the middle colonies. And there was fewer industries than in New England, obviously, because New England was packed by industry, but there was more than the South, which was dominated by tobacco. So it was that perfect medium for all of these three areas. So the distinction was that the middle colony's population was the most ethnically mixed. It was blessed with the most religious toleration, democratic control, and land was the most easily acquired in the middle colonies due to the generosity of the rulers in New York and Pennsylvania, as they wanted people to start exporting grain and help start making money for the colony. So overall, this is the end of chapter 2, chapter 3, I think. I'm sorry, and I really hope you guys learned a lot. We'll be starting to cover more and more of different colonies as we progress. But hopefully this was a good video, and I'm glad you guys watched it. Thank you for watching.